Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome once again to another episode of ICT's Counter-Terrorism Today, our podcast series that has been going on over Zoom the last couple months during the COVID-19 era. We have interviewed many scholars, practitioners, academics, and many other experts in the field of counterterrorism, terrorism, national security, all in the hopes of trying to understand how all these experts, how these journalists, how these academics and practitioners are able to cope with what is going on and how they're able to continue to battle terrorism in the COVID-19 era. In today's episode, we are very lucky to be joined today with Dr. Seth Franztman. Dr. Franztman is the op-ed editor and the Middle East affairs analyst at the Jerusalem Post. He has covered the war against Islamic State, 3 Gaza wars, the conflict in the Ukraine, refugee crises in Eastern Europe, as well as reports from Iraq, Turkey, Jordan, Egypt, Senegal, the UAE, and Russia. He is also the author of After ISIS, America, Iran, and the Struggle for the Middle East. Dr. Franztman, how are you doing today?
I'm good. How are you?
Excellent. I really appreciate you taking the time out of your busy schedule to join us here. And I like to start off by hoping and wishing that your family is doing well and that you and everyone are staying safe and healthy.
Yeah, I mean, we're trying our best. So it's so far it's so good.
Excellent. Glad to hear it. Let's jump right into the most pertinent question in this specific interview, and that is, as a journalist, as a war zone journalist, no less, how has COVID-19 affected your ability, but as well as journalists as a whole in the industry, ability to cover wars, cover what's needed to be covered for the people, and the ability to do your job appropriately? How has that been affected by COVID-19?
Well, I think there's 2 interesting sides to it. On the one hand, journalists are a bit privileged because most governments are not restricting our work, so we can still drive around and go outside during the lockdowns or whatever. But on the other side of the coin, international flights are mostly stopped. So therefore, if you're someone that's covering conflict or something like that, it's impossible to go to the places that you might have been used to going to. Either the flights are canceled, or if you got a flight there, you might be concerned that you can't get back or something. So I think that there's that issue. And of course, there's the health issue, which is, okay, what if I got there and I got sick or something? So it adds a whole nother layer, I think, of threats, which means the due diligence of trying to cover these conflicts from the front line or with people, you have to do it via Zoom and things like that. So you of course you can develop sources and you can do interviews, but it does certainly change the ability to do some of the color of the reporting that certainly made field reporting unique. In this era, of course, with so much stuff on social media, there are a lot of journalists that anyway are getting a lot of information from social media and blending that kind of with their work. So I think that means that most of us are basically doing that, or we're transitioning to just cover more local things.
And as you are forced to adapt to the new world order and how things are in the world, as you said, travel specifically, especially for a journalist such as yourself that extensively travels to the war zones and covers things on the front lines, how much harder is it now to develop new sources to be able to speak to you about, let's just, for example, what's happening in Syria?
I think that's very difficult. I mean, I think that means you basically have to hope that the people you spoke to or met in the past, that those people will be available to you, and insofar as you can lean on them a bit like a crutch and say, well, can you help me find some people or something? But I think that actually what we're seeing then realistically in the journalism world is an accelerating trend of what was already happening, which was that there was actually a lot less field journalism anyway. So actually, there's almost no one that is on the ground covering systematically most parts of Syria. And in fact, most of what you see when you see writing about Syria or commentating is people that are quote unquote experts or analysts, but they're primarily not based there, or they don't even go there. So I don't remember the last time a journalist was even in Afrin or Idlib or some of these areas. Eastern Syria was easier to get to, but now obviously that's not going to happen. So means we're relying on a lot more of local reports or people that were considered fixers or stringers, which is fine. I wish that the end result would be that major media would therefore rely more on local voices. But unfortunately, I think what is the trend overall in media is that there's an accelerating trend of primarily relying a lot on Western sources, and Western sources that are not even in the field. So that's something that's been happening, and now it's going to increase.
How much harder is it for journalists then to, I don't want to say convince, but how much harder is it for journalists to, I guess, relay accurate information that the public is able to trust?
I think it's difficult. I think that's why we don't have a lot of accurate information from northern Syria. We don't even have. When's the last time anyone saw a report, an in-depth report, about what's happening in Tel Abyad or Potzavidle or Afrin or in eastern Syria, for instance? When's the last time someone had a report from Deir ez-Zor or these places? I think there's an extreme lack of information. There's huge masses of the map of the world that are kind of a black hole, and I think that unfortunately, there is a kind of legacy media or maybe elitist feeling of, well, we can't rely on local sources, so then we'll just kind of rely on maybe wire services that themselves don't have very good reports. So for instance, if we're looking at the Libya conflict, which has really kicked off in the last several months, in which you have very big players like the Russians and the Turks involved there. Basically, from what I can tell, when I read about Libya, and I do read a lot about it, is you'll see people writing reports that are based on what someone saw on a video on Twitter. So it's like, well, that's very problematic. And then you have, of course, several experts that are quoted, but usually experts that follow the conflict, but themselves are not there. So it's so many layers in which the chances that something that is misinformation or partial information is like a kind of game of telephone, that the partial information was problematic. And as it went through this kind of sausage to be turned into a news story, it became even more and more problematic. And what you get therefore is a very, very small sliver of probably what's happening. You don't have people on the street. You just have a few government statements from the opposing sides and a small slice of color based on some videos someone has online or something like that. So that's a very big problem.
And as a journalist, I know that you take it quite seriously, the public's reactions and the public's responses to what's being written, as it does help shape public opinion on whatever the issue may be. So how does the public now shape an opinion? How does the public have trust in their government that things are going according to what they say they are? Because at this point, as you explained, it makes it much harder for journalists to do their job. And in a democracy, especially in a Western civilization, Western country, Western civilization, democracy, we rely heavily on journalism to hold our governments accountable, to give us accurate and trustworthy information so that we can shape our opinions as a society, but as well as react to whatever is happening and, if need be, react to our government's decisions.
Well, that's a big elephant in the room. I mean, I think if we looked at the last 10 or 20 years, you know, the accelerating use of social media, the increased distrust of legacy media, and the kind of massive megaphone that most authoritarian regimes now have in the form of, for instance, bankrolling basically Western or English language media that is coming out of either Turkey or Iran or Russia or China. And so you have these big state media operations that have a huge budget, but they basically are parroting one narrative. One type of propaganda or authoritarian propaganda. And then you have in the West newsrooms that are declining budgets and that have an inability to have as many field sources. So we're at a big disadvantage. And I think therefore it's not a surprise, by the way, if you look across, for instance, most of the Western world, I think that people, not only do they distrust media, but there's a lot of more insularity. Look at what's happening in the United States or Europe, what we call, for instance, populism, or even the protests against racism and things, which are totally appropriate. But that means that you have less and less interest or time to deal with foreign policy issues. So therefore, I think if you just look at the trend in most media, there's just less and less interest in those kind of explorative or think pieces or long form articles about these issues. And therefore, where we get our information, unfortunately, about those issues is too often deeply influenced by the authoritarian regimes that have the biggest budgets and the biggest megaphones. And that sets us up, I would think, for in the future, a less educated public, a less interested public in foreign policy, and therefore a narrative that is more dominated probably by authoritarian regimes and their media outlets.
And how does that affect domestic policy then moving forward?
Well, I think what we're seeing in the democracies, the remaining democracies in the world, is that domestic politics is becoming much more, much more interested in just what's happening at home. And I think that you can look to the recent, speech I think that Donald Trump gave to the West Point class, where he said, "Listen, it's not our problem to deal with the world's problems." And that's a fascinating speech, whether people agree or not with Donald Trump. It's a symbolic speech, because if you compare that speech to George H.W.'s speech, Bush's speech in 1990 about the quote unquote New World Order, just go compare the two texts. And one of them is a text that talks about world leadership and the United Nations and making the world about democracy and a rule of law. And the other one is a kind of Hobbesian world that's like, yeah, but that everything beyond our shore just doesn't matter. And I think on general, whether it's the radical left or radical right, we generally see a feeling that, yes, that's basically the reality, is what happens beyond my borders just does not matter. It's not our job to deal with it. And I think that, unfortunately, we see a lot more of that rhetoric and less pushback to say, well, no, wait, we want a rules-based order. We want a liberal world order.
It's very interesting, and I like how you stated and explained the fact that a lot of people are more in tuned or more concentrating now on their own borders, with what's going on within their countries. However, it's really ironic that this is the time that they turn inwards in that sense, when we are dealing with a global pandemic that sees no borders, has no borders. All it takes is one person to travel from one place to another, carrying the disease and spreading it around in that sense. So pretty ironic that this is the time people are turning inwards. And getting to that, how has COVID-19, outside of travel restrictions and what you explained earlier, affected the type of journalism that is being done?
Well, I think that would stand to reason, that because COVID-19, even though it transcends borders, it has caused borders everywhere to be radically shut. I mean, most people have barely left their houses or their communities, let alone cross state lines. Imagine Europe, for instance, with the Schengen zone and all the borders are basically closed, which is extraordinary. So I would think that therefore journalism is becoming much more local. When actually you could say that's a good thing, because we had a trend in which local papers were kind of dying and there was a lack of local news. And if people are going local, that in some ways it's a great thing. So it is good that journalists are kind of in some ways stuck in their community, and it's like, oh, you know what? I didn't even notice this community. I'm going to go out and report about it. I'm going to go in the streets. I'm going to look at police brutality. And I think one of the things in America that's interesting is there is a lot more awareness out there of militarized police and police abuse of individuals. In fact, including hundreds of journalists that were wounded in the last month of protests. So that means a lot of people are like, oh my God, I didn't even realize what was happening around me. So that is a good thing. The question is, though, is the overall trend in our society is just to kind of revert to a kind of 19th century kind of society, even when we have all this globalization or globalized internet and things.
Yeah, very interesting. And you brought up what's going on in the United States and some protests around the world. And what's happening in the United States is mind-blowing to see what is occurring on the streets between rioting, looting, peaceful protests, police brutality and violence. You see, interestingly, how President Trump cleared the Lafayette Park to get to his photo op in front of the church. And that was pretty violent encounter with protesters that apparently, allegedly, were peaceful at the time. So as a journalist that has been in multiple war zones and viewing what's going on in the United States, also being from the United States, what do you see going on there? How is a journalist meant to cover what is going on there? We have seen journalists get hit with tear gas. We've seen journalists get beaten by police. Some get arrested. We've seen journalists attacked by protesters and rioters. Really, from all ends, the journalists are taking it in those protests that are happening in the United States. So advice or anything that you could explain to our viewers on how would it be to cover such an event, How do you get the right information out there? Because at least someone on the sideline, such as myself, a lot of the information we get, as you mentioned, is a lot from social media. It's from standalone people that are there recording with their cell phones. So there is like snippets of videos if it's not a full video. What made the George Floyd video so unique was that you saw the full 9 minutes without cutting in and out, which is something we've seen often with a lot of these videos. So how is the job of a journalist to explain this to the public, to get accurate information, and to really be able to show everyone that there is multiple things happening? There are rioters, there are looters, there are peaceful protesters, there are police that are just doing their job, and there's obviously police that are brutalizing people. What advice or how would you explain that to the public?
Well, that's a good question. I mean, it's interesting. In the United States, it does seem to be a whole generation of people who were born basically after 9/11 that are the main ones involved in the protests. And it does seem that there is a feeling among them that they have been let down, I think, by my generation or the generation before, that obviously did not fix some of the issues, whether it's systematic racism or police brutality, or even, even just some existential questions like social mobility or ability to earn a living or something. So I think journalists, one thing that they need to do is obviously be out there in the streets to talk to some of these people and get a sense of, okay, well, what brought you out here? And obviously when it comes to looting and things in general, I mean, I covered a lot of protests in the Israel-Palestinian conflict years ago. And look, if the fact is that if there is a massive protest of thousands of people, but if one person gets shot or one person gets injured, in general, that's kind of where the cameras go. I think that one thing that's interesting in the United States is because most journalists were not used to covering riots or violence on their own soil. I think what we got used to over here is a bit of privilege, because I think the police here were very used to having journalists in between the kind of rioters that were clashing with Palestinians and Israel police or border police or the army. So there was a lot of understanding that, okay, that's a journalist and that's a person throwing a stone. And well, in general, I don't think journalists get injured here, but not as much as I saw in the U.S. And I think in the U.S., it shows that there's a lack of understanding among a lot of law enforcement of, yeah, well, actually, you're not supposed to hurt journalists. So one thing that America has to work through is, I think, a different relationship between the public and journalists, and an expectation that they will be there. And journalists themselves need to take the proper precautions. I don't know how many people I saw in those riots wearing a helmet or a quote unquote stab vest or different type, or thinking through some of like, okay, well, where should I stand and stuff. So I think that, that's obviously it's a quick education. I think unfortunately it seems that, several people were badly injured or someone lost an eye. So that's very, very awful. And therefore, hopefully there's some sort of discussion with local officials about like, yeah, you need to send a message that the journalists are not the enemy. They're here as well. So we'll see.
I hope that message does get through from all ends, because sadly we've seen since President Trump really kicked off his campaign, use the whole phrase of fake news. We've seen now here in Israel, Prime Minister Netanyahu use that several times. We've seen some other strong authoritarian leaders around the world start to use that phrase as well, fake news, fake news. And I believe that after years of that rhetoric, it's sort of seeping into the public, and you have a whole group of people, you witness it all the time, that attack CNN because calling them fake news, and attacking Fox News for being the puppet to the president at some points. And there is a deep distrust both between the government and the public now with the media. How does the media rebuild that trust both with the government and with the public? Because I believe that the media plays an integral role, and I don't believe everyone is anti-mainstream media in that sense. I think that there's just too much rhetoric coming from both sides that the public is more confused on who's legitimate media, who brings the real news and the sources. And as a top flight journalist, what would you have to say to that?
Well, I think that's right. What you say is interesting, because there is a systematic attempt to kind of make the media seem not legitimate. And I think that it does occur a bit on both sides, but it's certainly, there is this rising rhetoric. And I think one of the problems we then, with the result or the end result, is what happens. You see, is that the White House or what have you will rely primarily on journalists that they like, that are really, really totally in tune with their messaging, and then you'll see that on the other side of the coin, maybe when it comes to some of the protests or whatever, you have a few more radical journalists or whatever that are accepted as kind of part of the street, but then somehow anything that looks like a news crew is like attacked. And I don't know how the journalists can get all that back. I do think that one problem that we've had is that we have a lack sometimes of journalists being willing to sit down with average people and really spend time with them. You see, for instance, like even when there is this radical commune or whatever in Seattle, that, there's a lot of people that don't sometimes want to put in the time a bit to just sit with families or sit with people or be in the community. And that's the problem, is that journalists are somehow seen as oppositional, and they're seen as kind of elite. And you see these news programs where they don't even bother to invite anyone on who was in the protest. It's like 7 commentators, and they all probably seem to all know each other from high school. And you're like, I'm sorry, I can't listen to this program. Like, I just take the camera out. Let's see what these people are saying. And I found that during the protest, I was shocked by the degree to which half the time we just never heard from any of the people that were actually doing the protesting. We saw people shouting or looting, but no one ever seemed to bring the people into the studios. And I felt that that's not helpful. I think that I know specifically as someone who spent time in the field that, when you shelter with someone and there's tear gas around you, or when you shelter in a bunker and there's mortars exploding around you, you form an instant bond with that person. And then afterward, if you come back, you'll always be treated as kind of a brother. And I think that the willingness to get out there and do that, even if it sometimes means telling the police story, there's a story to be told by embedding with the police and saying like, oh, I see, okay, not everyone is brutal. I see the challenges you face. And that's something else the public probably should know something about, is, okay, well, what about these National Guardsmen and these police units? What are they facing every day? I don't know. I as the public, even if I'm a journalist, also want to understand that. So it seems that we have a lack of some of that. And maybe that is because of the nature of some of the business, which was not having enough people in the field, and also relying a lot more on analysts and commentators as like this kind of like quick bait, clapback, as opposed to like, well, I want like a person that's going to embed out there for a week because the budget's just not there for that person.
And in your opinion, how much does partisanship have to do with that in this era of 24/7 news cycles? You have channels like CNN that are just dedicated 24 hours to news and need to fill the airwaves, need to fill their time slots. And thus you have we've turned into a situation where people equate specific news outlets with a specific point of view, partisanship being a main problem there. Journalism, I went to journalism school, I learned it, I remember very clearly how it was all about trying to tell the full rounded story, not having an opinion, not having to express partisanship in any way. And your job was to create the discussion, explain the situation, report on it, and have the people have a discussion, and let them, shape their opinion, and then thus express it at the voting booth or in commentary, wherever it may be. So how do we rid ourselves of the partisanship that has seemed to seep into journalism, and that you have to now toe that line? Fox News must toe the Trump line. CNN is trying to be the anti-Trump line, or MSNBC. And we see it here in Israel. One of the main cases against the prime minister right now is his case where he tried to get favorable coverage from newspapers in exchange for other goods. And so how do we go back to a time where partisanship is not a main feature of journalism?
I'm not 100% sure that's possible. I mean, I think that, one of the issues is in the European context, there was always a sense that there were papers on the left or the right, whether it's Le Figaro or whatever, El País or something. So there was the feeling that a paper would be almost connected to like a youth movement, and it was like part of a whole ecosystem. So I'm not sure that, there is a bit of I would almost think it's almost a myth, the idea that we're totally impartial. I do think that there was an attempt to tell people that, but then I think what happened was especially with the more polarization we see with the recent administration and things, is that, if you have one part of the media that decides to be, involved in the resistance, or one part that's kind of telling the story of the party line, you're going to have an equal and opposite reaction. So that means if you're going to have a Fox News, then CNN, I guess, naturally started to trend a bit to being the very, very critical of Trump station. And then I guess in Israel, we have the same problem, which is that, we have some media like Israel Hayom, which is the prime minister's newspaper. So is it a big surprise that Yediot became somehow like, well, we're going to be the anti-Bibi? Because it's a problem. You're always going to have that equal and opposite reaction. I think if there's going to be one gorilla in the room that is for one party, then there's going to be another gorilla. And instead of like, well, there will be one gorilla for one party and then an impartial gorilla next to it. So I think that's one of the natures of what's happened in the business. I don't know if it's entirely ahistorical, because I think if we go back to William Randolph Hearst or whatever, yellow journalism in the 1890s, 1920s, I think it's a bit of a myth that journalists kind of tell themselves like, but we used to be impartial. It's like, well, no, there was a time maybe in the 70s or something when there was an attempt, this kind of very legacy media of this idea of no, we're in the center. And even the idea of like William F. Buckley once used to debate the Black Panthers or whatever, like there was this idea of like, well, you see, we can have both sides. And I guess maybe we're just going back to a different period, which is that we're going back to a more 19s, 20s, 30s era. And I think unsurprisingly, therefore, we have more instability, more populism, and more extremism, which is exactly what marked those eras.
Wow, very, very enlightening, very sobering to understand that and to hear that. I really enjoy going back into history and seeing where the dots get connected, and history always repeats itself. And I do not remember who says it, but basically the quote is that we always live in the past. There is no future and present. It's just a past repeating itself. And so when we look at that and we look at what concerns us moving forward now, how would you say the journalist industry must, or media industry must, adapt now to the coronavirus moving forward, knowing that there are still a multitude of conflicts going on, a multitude of high-level issues that need to be resolved, be it trade war between China and the United States. As you mentioned, Libya is a hot spot right now. There are reports of genocide happening in Afrin. How do journalists now adapt in COVID-19 era moving forward with the restrictions they have now to bring us the best possible reporting from these areas that are near impossible to get to now?
Well, it may be that we're just in a big hurdle, and we're not, and it will be difficult to get back to that. I think that one thing I discovered, I have a small team that I work with at this kind of a nonprofit I run called the Middle East Center for Reporting and Analysis. And one of the things we did actually establish 2 years ago, which was to start having a team of people on the ground in places like Iraq or Syria, or even people that some of them are from Iran and other places. And these were usually people that had been fixers, photographers, or in the journalist ecosystem. What we discovered is a lot of time local photographers or local stringers or fixers, they have access to 1,000 stories a week, but none of them ever get realized because they themselves are just waiting for whoever wants a story, and then they might go do it or take video of it, but they're not going out and doing the whole thing. So we started to try to leverage these people and pay them to write short stories or do interviews on the ground or go to places like during the Iraqi protests. We had a guy that was going over every day to these protests and putting his life in harm's way. And so you can do more of that. I guess that's one thing that, Western or whatever media that doesn't have the resources, doesn't have people on the ground, they're going to have to find those people. And I guess you'd have to increase budgets and actually have them on more. So I think there may be a budgetary problem, which is that a lot of media doesn't seem to be growing its budgets. They're much more interested in hiring a random analyst or a commentator, as I said, because it's a bit more clickbait than actually paying someone to go out and find a story somewhere. And therefore, unfortunately, it seems that these state media, whether it's RT or TRT or Al Jazeera, all these other places, they have these huge budgets, and they're the ones that are going to be bringing information. And the other side of the coin, of course, is therefore there are wire services like AP or Reuters. So you'll see the same exact story just repeated a bunch of times, but without without a lot of ability to go redo that story or go deeper. So you just kind of have that one little package, and that's kind of where we are. I don't know how in the midst of a COVID crisis, in which there's a massive economic crisis anyway and declining budgets, I don't see things can possibly improve. In fact, I would assume we'll see more culling of newsrooms, I guess.
Sad to hear an industry as important as news media and journalism having to be forced to cut, and the budgets are getting lowered so much so that we are missing massive news stories from around the world and great investigative pieces that help shape society, help shape our worldview, and maybe even would help shape that society to stop being so populist and maybe not as divisive as we are, both here in Israel, in the United States, and Europe. Division amongst the Western culture seems to be growing at a rapid rate, and I always thought that one of the remedies would be journalism and news media being able to inform and educate the public. And it's sad to hear that potentially they just don't have the resources to do that anymore. Before we let you go, Dr. Franztman, I wanted to ask you, first and foremost, where can our listeners go get the wonderful book that you wrote last year? And what are you currently working on?
So you can find the book on Amazon under After ISIS, America Ran the Struggle for the Middle East, under my name. And you can probably download it on Kindle, or you can order it. I mean, I guess you don't have to go to Amazon. You could probably find somewhere else. You could probably go to Geffen Publishing, where I publish it also, and buy it direct from them. And what I'm currently working on is actually a new book. I'm doing a research for a book called Drone Wars, which will look at the kind of future of warfare and why UAVs and drones are playing such a big role in places like Libya or Syria or the Gulf. And it's not surprising. I mean, we look at things like COVID. COVID, by the way, made a lot of militaries have to shut down their bases or not move troops around. But if you're not moving troops, you can still fly drones. And it looks like, I would say, countering the drone threat and using drones is really a futuristic thing. And it's not just about predators now and killing terrorists or whatever. It's about China. It's about Russia, all the big players, in which we will start to see, just like we saw with Iranian threats to the Gulf, for instance, we'll start to see drone swarms and things like that. So I'm doing a lot more research on that kind of high-level defense technology, and I'm very interested in it. And I think that they're, now that this kind of global war on terror maybe transitioning to a new era, we're going to see, it seems like a lot more big states using a lot more big technology, including Israel, which is, of course, Israel's a drone pioneer. So that's why, luckily, I'm here.
I look forward to this book greatly. I hope to see it out as soon as possible. It sounds extremely interesting. Dr. Franztman, thank you so much for your time. For anyone that is late to the conversation, Dr. Seth Franztman is the op-ed editor at the Middle East Affairs and analyst at the Jerusalem Post. He's covered multiple wars, the war against the Islamic State, 3 Gaza conflicts. He's been to the Ukraine refugee crisis. He's reported from Iraq, Turkey, Jordan, Egypt, Senegal, the UAE, Russia. And as mentioned, his latest book last year came out called After ISIS, America, Iran, and the Struggle for the Middle East. Dr. Franztman, thank you so much for taking the time out of your busy schedule to enlighten us about how journalists go about doing their job here in the COVID-19 era.
Thank you.
Appreciate your time.